Hello, everybody. My name is Paula Bontempi, and on behalf of my co-chair, Alan Mix, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first public meeting of the National Academy's Committee on the Future Directions for Southern Ocean and Antarctic Nearshore and Coastal Research. To start, I'd like to acknowledge that while this is a virtual meeting, the National Academies is physically housed on the traditional land of the Nacotchtank or Anacostan and Piscataway peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it through generations, and the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and the nations and this land. We thank them for their resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities to their example. We also acknowledge that our understanding of global change is closely related to and informed by Indigenous knowledge and experience, and that many Native communities are on the front line of impacts from these changes. I would also like to review our expectation for conduct. Here at the Academies, we're committed to fostering a professional, respectful, and inclusive environment where all can participate fully in a harassment-free and discrimination-free atmosphere. We look to each and every one of you to help us maintain a professional and cordial environment. Details on the Academy's policy on preventing discrimination, harassment, and bullying is available on the website. Now, for a bit of background, the National Academies is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is the nation's preeminent source of expert, evidence-based, and objective advice on science, engineering, and health matters. The National Academies provides independent, objective advice to inform policy with objective scientific findings, spark progress in innovation, and confront challenging issues for the benefit of society. This committee has been formed to produce a consensus report based on our statement of task, which you can see here. Importantly, we are tasked to identify high priority, near and long-term science drivers for the Southern Ocean and Antarctic nearshore and coastal research based on previous reports and studies. Determine the capabilities essential to support these science drivers and identify how NSF might address any gaps between the science drivers and existing portfolio of capabilities. The committee's report is expected in mid-September of 2023. The committee will be hosting a number of information gathering sessions between now and then to inform the report writing process. Specifically, we would like to highlight a community workshop that will occur on February 9th and 10th. Registration for the workshop is currently available on our website. This slide shows the provisional committee membership. Their bios can be found on our webpage. The formal comment period on the provisional committee ends on December 8th. Comments may be submitted via the project webpage. The agenda for today is shown here. The intent of this initial information gathering session today is to introduce our committee to the study background. Before we kick off the first session, I want to note that this is an open, on-the-record session. It is being live streamed and will be archived for later viewing after the event. Given this meeting's time constraints, we will not be holding a public comment session today, but you are welcome to submit public comment in writing through the study webpage. We will also hear from the community during the workshop planned for early February. The purpose of this meeting today is to gather information to help the committee conduct its study. This committee will examine the information and the material obtained during this and other public meetings in an effort to inform its work. Comments made by individuals, including members of the committee, should not be interpreted as positions of the committee or of the academies. In addition, committee members typically ask probing questions in these information gathering sessions that may not be indicative of their personal views. The committee will deliberate thoroughly before writing its draft report. Moreover, once the draft report is written, it must go through a rigorous review by experts who are anonymous to the committee. excuse me, and the committee then must respond to this review with appropriate revisions that adequately satisfy the Academy's Report Review Committee and the NAS president before it is considered an official Academy's report. Therefore, observers who draw conclusions about the committee's work based on today's discussion will be doing so prematurely. So with that, I will say thank you and hand it over to my co-chair, Alan Mix.
Thanks, Paula. My name's Alan Mix, and as co-chair of this study, I will be moderating the next section of the meeting. We're now going to move to our next item on the agenda. The statement of task provided to the committee asks us to identify highest priority science drivers for Southern Ocean and Antarctic nearshore and coastal research based on prior studies and reports. Thus, we'll now hear from committee members and National Academy staff regarding studies on oceanography and Antarctic research that were completed in the last decade or so. We will hold questions at the end and then have time for Q&A. First, we will hear from Amanda Stout. Amanda is the director of the Polar Research Board at the National Academies and oversaw several reports on Antarctic research in the last decade, including future science opportunities in Antarctica and Southern Ocean in 2011, and a strategic vision for Antarctic and Southern Ocean research in 2015. So Amanda, welcome.
Thank you so much, Alan. And good afternoon and good day to everybody who is joining here today. So I am going to give a very quick tour through some of our past reports, more as a way to give the committee and the community some direction and where they might want to look for more information, because I'm not an Antarctic expert. And so I cannot possibly do justice to all the great thinking that our committees have done in these topics over the last decade or so. So if we go to the next slide, I first wanted to call attention to a report that came out in 2011 on future science opportunities in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. And the main outcome of that report was the committee came up with these big 8 science questions, 4 around global change, as you see here, in terms of how Antarctica will contribute to changes in global sea level, the role of Antarctica and the Southern Ocean in global climate system, one around biota and ecosystems and how they are changing, and a 4th around how Antarctica has affected the changing planet in the past. And then there were another 4 questions focused on discovery, another one around past records and how they help us understand climate, how life has adapted in these environments, and then using Antarctica as a platform to understand the Earth and space environment and the origins of the universe. So this one came out in 2011, and a few years later, NSF returned to the National Academies. And if we go to the next slide, they asked us to do a follow-on study to provide some more strategic focus around those big 8 science questions. As part of this study, we did extensive community outreach and held a number of listening sessions around the country. And the committee came up first with a way to evaluate some criteria here for identifying some priorities among all of the areas that they were highlighted in the 2011 reports. And I thought this might be useful to the committee as you're beginning your thinking. This 2015 committee felt that the nature of the science, a compelling science question, needed to be the primary filter in thinking about strategic priorities. They came up with a set of secondary filters that they used, looking at things like whether science questions were time sensitive in nature, the potential for societal impact, the readiness and feasibility of the science, and if science areas were a key area for U.S. and National Science Foundation leadership. And then after that, they applied a tertiary set of filters that were considering things like the partnership potential, impacts on the overall balance of the program, and the potential to help bridge disciplinary divides. So, often we'll see and I'll show on the next slide the priorities, but I think it's helpful sometimes to also think about how the criteria that we're using coming up with those priorities. So here are the three large recommendations of strategic priorities that came out of that 2015 report. The first is around how fast and by how much sea level will rise, and that had two components: multidisciplinary initiative to look at changing Antarctic ice sheets in key sections of the ocean, largely focused on the Thwaites Glacier area. And then a second component about using the past, using paleoclimate records to help us understand and think about the future. The second large priority that this committee came up with was around how Antarctic biota evolve and adapt to changing environment. And in particular, applying the emerging science in the various kinds of omics to looking at Antarctic organisms and ecosystems. And then the third big area was around the origins of the universe. And this committee recommended a continued investment in the next generation of the cosmic microwave background studies. It's also worth noting that this committee recommended continuing to support a cross-cutting range of investigator-driven research across the many areas of the NSF portfolio. And they identified a number of foundational elements to support that scientific, both the core programs and these priority areas. And my last couple of minutes, I wanted to highlight on the next slide, two workshops that the academies have done over the last few years. One was looking at Antarctic sea ice variability in the Southern Ocean climate system. And this workshop was held in 2016. And so that's really focused on that particular problem at that time of trying to understand what we were seeing in terms of records of Antarctic sea ice at the time. And then a second workshop that was held just earlier this year on technology developments to advance Antarctic research. That workshop proceedings will be released on next week. And so they had a whole number of sessions around different kinds of technologies that could support Antarctic and polar research generally. And those workshop presentations and videos are available online if anyone would like to look at any of those. And then lastly, I just wanted to flag another report that's broader than just the polar piece, but might be of interest to this group. We did a large study for National Science Foundation, came out about a year ago on next generation Earth system sciences at the NSF. And their charge included coming up with a set of key characteristics of an integrated approach. And as listed here, looking across things like advancing both curiosity-driven and use-inspired basic research, facilitating convergence of social, natural, and computational engineering sciences, a number of pieces around the workforce, including diverse, inclusive, equitable, and just approaches to the sciences, including stakeholders, et cetera. And so I just wanted to call this report to the attention of this committee as well, since it is something that's providing a broader context for how NSF is looking at Earth system sciences. And with that, I am finished and we'll look forward to the dialogue later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. We'll now hear from Jim Bellingham. Jim is the executive director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Assured Autonomy in Baltimore and was a member of the committee that produced the 2011 report on critical infrastructure for ocean research and societal needs. Jim, welcome.
Thank you, Alan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So this panel was chaired by Eric Barron, and Rana Fine was the vice chair. I gather neither of them are available to give their report out here, so you're getting me. It was a report which really was driven by a desire of prioritizing investments in U.S. Infrastructure for the ocean sciences. To give a little bit of history. You all will recall that sort of those was the early days of the OOI as it was kicking off, which was a bit controversial, and there was a lot of discussion about the ocean fleet maintaining the ocean fleet. And so this was an effort to sort of corral the ocean community around what are the important issues and what's the right infrastructure to support those topics. The request was to first define the science that folks wanted to do, what are the important science questions, and then define the infrastructure. So I won't talk about the infrastructure conclusions, which are largely process oriented in any case, but I will go over how the panel approached the science questions. So I will say that the science questions were heavily filtered by, in many cases, by societal needs. So there was quite a bit of discussion of societal needs during the panel. And in fact, if you look at the grouping of science questions that came out of it, they have a direct connection to how the oceans in effect affect people and how people affect the ocean. So the first one, the first general category and largest general category of topics was enabling stewardship of the environment. And you might think of that as largely focusing on issues revolving around the changing ocean. And then the second one was protecting life and property. And you can imagine that things like tsunamis and so on were in that categories. The third one was directly looking at environmental impact. So it was promoting sustainable economic vitality. And that was a pretty small one, really. There's really only 3 topics in that. And then the final one was really the fundamental questions. And that was increasing fundamental scientific understanding of the oceans. So I'll go through these in a little bit more detail here, going back to enabling stewardship of the environment. So this one, as you can imagine, was very heavily shaped by concerns about ocean role in climate. Topic 1 is one that I think shows up in all of your Antarctic discussions, which was how will sea level change on a range of spatial and temporal, how will sea level change on a range of spatial and temporal scales, and what are the potential impacts? So this was clearly one that was driven by societal concerns. But then there were a set of ones which really revolved around understanding kind of more fundamental mechanisms of how the physical ocean interacts with the biological ocean. So how will climate change influence cycles of primary production? How will the marine ecosystem structure, biodiversity, and population dynamics be shaped by a changing ocean environment? And how will marine organisms and ecosystems be affected by ocean acidification? So, of course, all of those were topics discussed heavily in the time. And then many of these other topics kind of flow out of that. So how do distributions and fluxes of ocean carbon components evolve in an altered ocean? So quite a bit of discussion of carbon export and how our carbon export would change as a warming ocean perhaps became more stratified. So how will the ocean circulation and distribution of heat in the ocean and atmosphere respond to both natural and anthropogenic drivers? And then a discussion, of course, of how will alterations in the global water cycle influence the ocean. So as you can imagine, a lot of these overlap, and many of them you could see sort of dropping into some of the other categories, which was acknowledged in the report. There are also some topics which looked a little more regionally, in one case, really focusing on what are the atmosphere, ocean, terrestrial interactions in a changing Arctic, but also how will coastal ecosystems and communities respond to multiple stresses? And if you read the text of that, although it's in the enabling stewardship of the environment, it's heavily driven by or shaped by an acknowledgement that humans are moving to the coastlines. And so a larger and larger fraction of the coastal population is in those regions. And also by the fact that a large part of the fisheries are in the coastal environment, and a large part of the ocean productivity is in that environment, despite the fact that it's a fairly small fraction of the ocean. So there were two topics in this section which really revolved around very specific concerns. One was what advances will be made in prediction and mitigation of oil spills and industrial accidents in the ocean. So a big concern about sort of growing human activity in the ocean and what are the consequences of that, and do we understand it? And then on a much larger scale, what are the potential impacts on the ocean from geoengineering? So this was, of course, a topic that was more about, what might humans be tempted to do if climate change becomes something people decide has to be responded to, and if they do, if we seed the atmosphere and reduce insulation, what would the consequences for the ocean be, and so on. So those were the topics under enabling stewardship of the environment. Protecting life and property really revolved around understanding a number of sort of Earth, major Earth system threats, right? So how does strain accumulate in underwater volcanoes and offshore fault zones, and how do you predict major events? So this was a big discussion among parts of that group. And then tsunamis. Can we have a better understanding about how they're generated? Can we do a better job of predicting them? Same thing with storms, major storm events. Can we predict them better? Can we predict their intensification better? Can we predict the paths better? And then also a set of questions revolving around sea ice and icebergs. How will that change in the future, and how will those changes impact us? A bit of discussion about impacts on, for example, Arctic coastline. There's a discussion there. A lot of the discussion, I have to say, tended to be Arctic focused rather Antarctic focused as you got to higher latitudes. And then discussions about the effects of coastal pollutants and pathogens on human and ecosystem health, and the larger impacts on the coupled ocean climate system on human health and welfare. So promoting sustainable economic viability, really kind of three topics that rose to the top in there. How can humans ensure sustainable food production in the ocean? So this question is we're down to 1 minute. Okay, so this was really revolved around sort of the pressures of an increasing population. A discussion about extract mineral resources. Are there sustainable ways to extract mineral resources from the ocean? And the same question with energy. And then the final topics really were increasing fundamental scientific understanding. A lot of the same themes reappear. So questions about how the ocean interior works, how it affects the plate boundaries, hotspots, and other surface manifestations. And then what are the lessons we learned from the ocean in terms of plausible rates and magnitudes of climate change? Questions about ocean atmosphere interactions. Are there better ways to parameterize it? Fundamental questions about fluid circulation within the ocean crust, and how do those impact the chemistry and biology of the subsea floor? A lot of questions about the fundamental origin of life in particular questions about regulating diversity and rates of molecular and biochemical evolution in the ocean as well. So questions about diversity of the deep sea pelagic, and the modes and roles of sensory systems in interspecies communication and structuring marine ecosystems. That's largely about microbes there, about interactions of microbial species. And then the final sort of big one was, how does the ocean contribute to the Earth carrying capacity? So those were the drivers, the fundamental questions that then drove the rest of the infrastructure discussion. Alan, hope I didn't go too far over there.
You're good. Thanks, Jim. We'll now hear from David Kitley. Dave is the affiliate director at Penn State and was a co-chair on the committee that produced the 2015 Decadal Survey of Ocean Sciences, also known as the Sea Change Report. Dave, welcome.
Thanks, Alan. Looking through, the members on this committee, you guys could I'm not sure you even need me. I mean, you've got what? You were on it, of course, Alan. Ed was on the committee. Roberta was on the committee. now with NSF. And I saw Deb Glickson on the Zoom here. So there's lots of people who can correct me. I will give the caveat that I'm doing this from the slides and of course from a memory that probably has rose-colored glasses because you forget some of the things that happened. So let's go to the next slide, please. And yeah, who's driving the slides here? Okay, well, while we're figuring out who's driving the slides, or maybe they've changed, I can't see them. Okay.
The first slide.
There we go. Can we get the next one? Okay. Well, rather than spend a lot, there we go. Okay. It'll come up. Yeah, if we go through the statement of task, I guess this one just gets built here. There's about 4 or 5 bullets. It's somewhat similar to the reports you've heard already, except this committee was really asked to look at budget. So budget became a driving factor, and I'll show you a graph here a little bit later on. Yeah, especially bullet 4 there. So we certainly looked at, in fact, I would say we spent, a third to half of our time working the science priorities, and I'll go through the process how we did that. But really, we needed to come in on cost as opposed to, kind of go for the unobtainium and fantastic perfect science, but NSF was already, or at least the ocean side was already in quite a lot of issues there. So I kind of called this the tough love report. NSF pretty much knew they needed that. They kind of knew what the answer was, but it's sometimes helpful to have an external committee, and it's also very helpful when you're trying to sell hard things, of course, to the Congress, to be able to have that report in your hand. Next slide, please. Okay, so big committee, I think 21 members. I've mentioned some already, 5 NAS members, 1 NAE member, and everybody had different disciplines, but also different expertise. Some were really process guys. We had, the late Bob Payne, probably, the star of individual PI-driven research. Others were on very large teams. So we had a pretty good cross-section here. Next. We did, and we've already heard from both Amanda and Jim, certainly other committees do this. This isn't anything like groundbreaking, but we did try quite aggressively, I would say, to get community input. So AGU, Oceans, 400 responses. I know for me personally, and Alan, Roberta, Ed can certainly comment if they agree or disagree, I thought some of the most impactful discussions we had were actually with the early career, the young investigators, because it really brought home that we're doing this report really for the future. Most of the people on the committee, you've kind of done, a large part of what it is you're going to do in your career. The postdocs, the, just about to get a PhD, the assistant professors, they've got their career ahead of them, and really listening to what they said, I thought was time very well spent for us, and it made a big difference. Next slide, please. There we go. So we had the decadal reports. If we want to talk about them in Q&A, we can. I think Jim went through his, and there was, not surprisingly, quite a lot of overlap. We came down to 8. And if you're interested how we came down to that, we basically used normative governance techniques and an analytical hiring process. So in page 27, 28 of our paper report, we actually talk about those processes. We have the references if anybody's useful. So it wasn't just, kind of like sitting around a table. To sort of get to from 300 inputs down to 30 inputs, we kind of bin them by ocean, climate, ecosystems, and the subsea. And then really to get it down from 30-ish down to the 8 that you can see up here on the screen, we looked at 4 priorities. And in priority order, it was transformation potential, benefits to society, was it ready, and what were the partnership potentials. And then we basically applied what I call best professional judgment. And if you read the report, we basically owned it. I mean, you saw who was on the committee. And at the end of the day, there is committee judgment involved. I mean, if it was just an algorithm, we could fire everybody, right? And, I'll hire one of those unemployed Twitter coders and we'll write the algorithm and we'll be done. It's much, much more than that, of course. That's why we have the academy, why we have the review, why we have, basically we had hundreds and hundreds of years of expertise on that committee. And, so we use that expertise and we make no apologies for some of this is qualitative. And I think that's an important part that your committee will likely go through. Next slide, please. Okay, so then we had to, once we got to there, we really took a look at what was the infrastructure. And, the three big things were, I think it was ships, it was drilling, it was OOI, that accounted for like 90% of the budget. And then we aligned, and if we could go to the next slide, please. We would actually, next one, we would align that, those big infrastructure, which was down the rows, if you will, with our 8 science priorities. And we would put, was this critical or was this important? And we were looking for pieces of infrastructure that both served large numbers of these priorities or were absolutely critical to doing at least one of them. And again, there was some judgment involved in this, but that's kind of at the end of the day, what then drove the recommendations as to, where to take less risk, where to take more risk, but trying to come up with a budget that was not only balanced, but would be sustainable to NSF, to provide adequate infrastructure to study these big problems, big challenges that we're having, but also have sufficient funding so that we could fund the scientists, so that all those young investigators we talked to would not decide that being a barista at Starbucks was in fact a more promising career. Next slide. So another way we kind of looked at sort of infrastructure versus relevance is, again, once we had that slide I just showed you there, you could kind of feel for, by pieces of infrastructure, what was relevant. And then we looked on the vertical axis, how much did it cost? Ships are expensive. Everybody knows that, but they were very, very relevant. So they ended up in the top right-hand side. Of course, the place you don't want to be is up in the top left, where you have high cost and maybe not quite as much relevance there. And things that were down low cost, they're not quite decimal dust, but we're not going to move huge budgets with things on the bottom there. Next. So, okay, that tells me that I'm just about done here. This is a slide that was really driving things. We, at the beginning of the century, we were roughly 2/3 science, 1/3 infrastructure. And when we were putting this report out, those lines were crossing. And if we didn't do anything, we were kind of flipping it. And that was really the motivation for much of what we did. So I'm not going to go through all of the recommendations there, but I'll just let you kind of glance at these. And again, of course, they're in the report, but the takeaway I have here is they were pretty specific. We were telling them, it wasn't quite the screwdriver, but we were pretty specific on the kinds of recommendations, and not only for NSF, which actually took quite a few of these recommendations, but again, to help the Congress and the committees understand we have to do these. And of course, for Congress, it's oftentimes pretty easy to fund infrastructure because that's jobs in districts, and maybe not quite as easy to fund some of the other things. So we wanted to, kind of not be wishy-washy on this, but it's like, hey, if you're going to change that curve I showed you on that last graph, we've got to fix it. And then we gave them some longer-term sort of tenets, if you will, to help them kind of stay balanced, so that there wouldn't be another committee in 10 years that would have to do the same thing. And let me stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. We're actually right on time, doing very well. We now have some minutes for questions for Dave, Jim, and Amanda. And also note that I see Deb Glickson has gotten off the metro and is actually on her Zoom and off her phone. So Deb is here too. Deb is the director of the Board on Earth Sciences and Resources. So she is available in this session for questions as well. Open to hand raises, and all of a sudden my screen has made everyone disappear. That's interesting. Okay, well, I see a hand from Kim Bernard.
Hi, David, I was curious to know how you determined the relevance of those different, I guess, platforms and facilities. For instance, how did you determine that OOI has low relevance?
So what we did was we first, as I mentioned, went through those science priorities, and we kind of said, let's that, kind of drive the rest of the discussion. So then we said, to do these priorities, what is it that you need to be successful? And again, really not looking at every piece of ocean infrastructure, but the most costly ones. And if I remember correctly, we basically said, if you do not have something, you cannot do the mission. You cannot do that priority. So that would be critical. Or something that is like, I would really, really, really like to do this. This is going to increase safety. It's going to increase the science. It's going to decrease cost, time, etc. That would be important. And otherwise, if it was nice to have, then we didn't. It's like, okay, everything's nice to have. So we just kind of laid that out against those priorities and kind of, let the chips fall where they may. So we didn't come out to say, well, geez, OOI should go away, or we should double OOI, or, ships are a relic of the 20th century and we should all be autonomous and, let Jeff Zuckerberg or whatever run the whole thing. We just said, hey, here's the priorities. And again, 21 members, 5+ NAS members, best professional judgment, everything that we knew. How did this come out? So, it would be interesting, as we now get to the end of the decadal survey, to see, does this actually look reasonable? It's not perfect, of course, but is it reasonable, or do we look like Disney's Tomorrowland? Hopefully not too much of that. But, that was always a fear, is when you're doing these things is, you can't see the future because you're so locked in. So we tried hard not to get there, but we also try to not just wish real barriers away. The ocean is hard, right? We all know that. It's even harder in the polar regions. So we weren't just going to, sprinkle fairy dust on everything and assume magically technology's just going to fix this. So that's anyways, but that's how we did it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Paula.
Yes, thank you. For the helpful discussions. Could you talk, all of you, I guess, a little bit about how in your respective efforts you might have addressed resources or resource robust or constrained environments in the studies that you undertook?
Jim, you are muted.
Yeah, I'll just comment that our committee struggled with that. So we took a couple of stabs at making tables that were probably far too detailed versions of the one that David showed, with kind of some granularity of what your observations were, pillaring them against the specific set of science questions which had been identified, which is where I think most of the effort went. And so I don't, ours really largely generated a process and kicked that can a little bit further down the road, to be perfectly candid. So I have to honestly say that I don't, if you read our report, I don't think you find a clearly articulated set of priorities in terms of which assets are really the critical assets that need to be invested in for which in a way was why the following study was so essential.
And if I can just add on to that, I also think, the scope of the critical infrastructure for ocean sciences was a little bit different than the decadal survey in that it had something like 13 sponsors. It was across the federal agency. So it would have been really, really hard to try to get down to dollar levels. And instead it tried to focus on affordability and efficiency. So it sort of took a broad view of that. Whereas the decadal survey for ocean sciences we were really asked, what would you have to give up? What would you need? How could you maximize your work and where could you not necessarily get to? It was not a blue sky report from that perspective. We've done other studies for NSF where we've been given a little bit more opportunity to not have a resource constrained environment. And then we've been given ones like this specific statement of task that does ask for some acknowledgement that there won't be a huge amount of money floating in or that there won't be giant pots that just appear magically out of nowhere.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, hopefully you got from the very brief presentation. Yeah, cost was, a huge driver in our report. And even with that, though, we did spend quite a bit of time developing those science priorities. We do have in the report, it's not a huge report, but towards the end, we do talk about, hey, if the budgets go up, do X. If the budget is in fact, basically no growth or no real growth, here's the primary recommendations. And worst case, if your budget continues to decline in real terms, we also put in, now you need to do Y. So we tried to give some pretty specific advice for sort of real world. I guess that's probably why I was one of the co-chairs. I know something about oceanography, but if you work in the Pentagon and survive, you know something more about budgets. And that was really, we wanted it to be specific. They could accept or reject, and that's fine. But if they decide to accept, again, it gives NSF something pretty powerful to go to the committees, congressional committees with, and the broader community. To say, why are we doing this? Because nobody likes cutting stuff, and we didn't find anything that NSF was doing that was like worthless or anything like that. It was all good, but you can't afford everything.
I will say that one of the things that was, if you read the summary of the critical infrastructure report, what you'll find is that it kind of refers back to a chapter which actually does a pretty good job, I think, of canvassing all the different sort of tools that you have available, from the human occupied assets to the unmanned assets to satellite systems, and calls out a bunch of fears. Right. So, you don't want to, for example, you don't want to replace a satellite system with another satellite system and have no overlap, of the data set. So one of the things I think we did sort of a reasonable job of was call out those types of concerns. If you're going to commit to these assets, here's kind of the minimum in a way. The other thing was to highlight the importance of the data centers and modeling. So ocean modeling was called out as sort of a bit of an infrastructure element, and there was a bit of a discussion in the report about making all of these things accessible broadly to the community. So I think these were things that you might not normally think of as infrastructure, since we tend to be pretty ship and platform centric, but which are really an essential part of the infrastructure and a really significant part of costs, truthfully.
So, Amanda.
Sure. Yeah. Just on the two Antarctic reports, the 2011 report was intended to be a kind of blue sky. So cost was not really a major consideration in that. And then the 2015 report, the committee commented on the cost implications, and I'm just looking at what they said at the time for the genomics initiative and the cosmic microwave background. At the time, they sort of roughly estimated that those programs could be supported within the existing core funding within OPP for those areas. And then the committee sort of roughly said that this changing Antarctic ice sheets initiative potentially would require additional resources. They tried to make the case that the urgency and the societal impact of that work might justify, redirecting funds there. And they also gave some suggestions about the opportunities to partner, for example, with the British Antarctic Survey and doing some of that work. So that's generally how they kind of they were very much thinking at that time that it was largely working within a budget constrained environment, and they understood that they needed to make a pretty strong statement if they were going to call for additional funding, and they didn't do a very a detailed deep dive review of the specific costs of anything.
This is getting into some interesting issues relative to the mandate of our report. And I think, Deb, you brought it up first, that was some reports have multiple agencies involved and so on, some are blue sky, not budget limited, some are very budget driven. And what we're tasked with is somewhat has elements of all of that. We're asking for science drivers in a budget limited world related to some infrastructure. And yet the science drivers are not limited to a single agency. They inherently cross all these boundaries. And so we're going to need to balance some of those elements. So I think this conversation about that is really interesting, about how we think about this. Any other questions from the group? I don't see any other hands up. Okay, well, we are about right on schedule for where we thought this might finish. If there are no other further comments, Paula, do you have any comments on this one?
No, that was incredibly helpful, though. Thank you for the overview.
Yes, thank you all for those presentations. So with that, I will pass the baton to Paula, who will address the next part of our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, everybody, all of our speakers. Moving into the next part is a little bit about the National Science Foundation and the Statement of Task. We move on to hear from our study sponsors. First, Roberta Marinelli, the Office Director, and then Tim McGovern, the Ocean Projects Manager from the Office of Polar Programs, that will be presenting. They'll be joined by several others from their office for Q&A. So with that, I guess I'll turn it over to Roberta first.
Sure. Hi, Paula and Alan. Thank you both for agreeing to chair the committee. And thanks to all of the committee members. Many of you I know, many of those of you who I don't, I look forward to meeting. And I also, hi, Dave. How are you doing? Thank you so much for presenting some of the thoughts from the DSOS report. And in fact, when we started to go down this path of asking the community to help us frame the argument for this vessel and also the broader picture of Antarctic sciences, first and foremost in my mind was the DSOS report and how we knew that we had limitations, but we had aspirations as well, and how to make the right argument for science to go forward in a budget limited world. And having become very familiar with that, both as a member of that committee and as an agency person and an academic scientist, when I found myself in my current position, I immediately contacted Deb Glipson, who was also one of the project directors for the DSOS study, and asked for her help. So what we're going to do in the next 20 to 25 minutes is to give you some background as to how we got to this point in terms of the vessels that we have, our prior efforts to develop a new vessel description, where those efforts have gone, and why we are where we are now. Tim McGovern has put together a wonderful presentation that includes a lot of background data that I think will help you understand how we got to this point and why we arrived at the statement of task that we have. We'll briefly review it, but then at that point, I think it will be appropriate to just throw it open to questions so that you can gain as much understanding of the statement of task as possible, and also ask questions if you feel that perhaps some aspects of it need to be refined. I know that the SOT is one of the most important things to get right in a study. And so we certainly want to make sure that we're all on the same page as we go forward. With that, if there aren't any other questions, I'll turn it over to Tim and he can start the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Roberta. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Can everybody see that? Okay. So good afternoon. And as Roberta and as I was introduced, so my name is Tim McGovern. In addition to being Ocean Projects Manager in the Office of Polar Programs, I'm also the ARV Program Manager. I've worked with many of you, either over email or virtually. Paula, it's good to see you again. And I've even sailed with a few of you. So Kim and Ed, good to see you both again as well. Today, I'd like to provide a bit more depth in terms of the background leading up to where we currently are with the ARV project and its anticipated capabilities. And just so folks are aware, I can't see any of you, so if there's any sort of issues, please just give a shout. So to start, I'd like to remind everyone of our current icebreaking research vessel, the Nathaniel B. Palmer, or NBP. This vessel was purpose-built for NSF by Edison Schwest Offshore back in 1992 and has been under continuous long-term contract since then. So ECO owns the ship and operates the vessel on behalf of the USAP. So while the NBP was delivered in 1992, soon after, the science community began discussing an NBP replacement that was larger and more capable. So for the next few years, various studies and reports were put out trying to capture the requirements of this new polar research vessel, or PRV, which was envisioned to regularly operate in both the Antarctic and the Arctic. So here you can see just some of the studies and the reports and meeting notes compiled over the years. ARVOC, as many of you probably know, is the Antarctic Research Vessel Oversight Committee, which is no longer active. So the NBP replacement effort ultimately led to the establishment of a PRV Science Mission Requirements, or SMR, refresh committee in 2010 and 11. A large workshop was held in February 2011 that was attended by many researchers, as well as naval architects, designers, technical experts, and ship drivers. And I suspect we have a number of those participants tuning into the webcast right now. So the resulting report was delivered in February of 2012. So the PRV, as specified in the refreshed science mission requirements, was for a roughly 390-foot long, almost 14,000 long ton Polar Class 3 vessel. The Polar Class, or PC, is an international maritime designation indicating what polar conditions a ship can safely operate in. Internally at NSF, a proposal with the vessel characteristics defined by the PRV science mission requirements was developed and ultimately submitted to the NSF director and the MRAFC board. MRAFC, I'm sure you all know, is the NSF Major Research Equipment and Facilities Construction. Unfortunately, this proposal was denied for a few reasons. One, there was a blue ribbon panel study that was underway, and the board wanted to wait until that report was delivered to determine if the scientific demand was sufficient. The board also wanted the OPP team to further the analysis of alternatives, or AOA, to look at leasing options. And while those two efforts were continuing, we also continued to look at the operational costs of a PRV-like vessel and came to the determination that it exceeded our combined NBP and LM Gould operational budgets. The Gould is our other research vessel that we operate. So we had to start over. We then explored leasing vessels that were either NBP-like or had some PRV-like capabilities, such as the increased ice breaking or berthing capacity. Unfortunately, this too led to a dead end. We found that leasing vessels not only exceeded the combined NBP and Gould operational budgets, but did so by around 400% due to the need for commercial entities to recover the full construction costs of building new ships. That makes sense. However, further putting the nail in that coffin was new Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, capital leasing requirements. And that's affectionately referred to as OMB Circular A11, if you really want to get into it. This essentially would have required NSF to front load the full 30-year lease costs prior to entering into a leasing contract. So then we reverted back to the MRFC approach. We tasked our OPP advisory committee to stand up an ad hoc subcommittee to review all the science mission requirements reports developed over the prior decade, reach out to the science community to validate them, and provide a refresh that we could use to develop a new MRFC proposal. At NSF, we were careful to moderate the size and capability of the proposed vessel so that it would remain within our operational budget forecasts. This time, the resulting ARV was successfully allowed to enter into the MRFC process, entering the conceptual design phase. So that occurred in June of 2021. And by September 2021, due to the advanced readiness of the ARV design, we successfully conducted a conceptual design review. By December of last year, the NSF director approved our advancement to the preliminary design phase, and in January, we started that new phase. So the ship has grown slightly, but we remain confident that we are still within our anticipated operational budget. And next year, in late February, we will be holding our preliminary design review, and if we are successful, we'll be advancing to the final design phase. So where are we in terms of the overall project schedule? So this slide shows the full 10-year high-level schedule of the ARV. All MRFC projects are required to pass through the various stage gates or off-ramps before MRFC funding for construction is awarded. So in the design stage, we've got the conceptual, the preliminary, and the final design reviews. And those are all formal hurdles that we must pass through. Each of those is followed by a thorough internal NSF review and approval process by the NSF director, making the decision to proceed. Circumstances or criteria that would inform NSF's decision to halt or cancel the project might include the availability of funding. That's obviously a big one. A change in agency priorities, or the feasibility of completing the project on schedule and within budget. So, as I mentioned, we successfully completed this conceptual design review last year, began preliminary design this year, go through preliminary design review early next year, and then the next stage gate coupled with the director's approval to enter the final design phase and the National Science Board approval to include the ARV project in the FY26 MRFC budget request. So MRFC funded construction stage consists of detailed design, construction, and transition to operation phases. Transition to operation, that stage includes the outfitting and provisioning of the new ship, crew training, science trials, ice trials. And then, if all goes according to plan, we'll have the final acceptance by NSF in early 2031 and start 40 years of service, which coincides with the MV Palmer reaching 40 years of age. So this is our plan. Now, the current design of the ship is a significant enhancement over the Palmer. From all the science community generated reports on the desired capabilities of a new icebreaking research vessel, there really were three key elements and significant cost drivers that were common throughout. And that was icebreaking capability, endurance, and the number of science and technical personnel it could accommodate. So those have been identified as our three key performance parameters, or KPPs, which must be achieved. So the ARV is going to be bigger. It's going to allow for more scientists, more lab space, more deck space, longer endurance, and far greater icebreaking capabilities over our existing Palmer. And here you can just see the silhouette, the size differences between the Palmer and the new ARV. Whoop. Okay, so to give you a better sense for the structural capabilities of the new ARV, this slide shows the side-by-side comparison of the MVP compared with the ARV. Image on the left are ice conditions on July 1st of this year, showing PC 4 or 5 restrictions. So that's polar class 4 or 5, which is comparable to the Palmer. The light green are areas of ice that the MVP could readily navigate. Orange are more difficult, but doable. Areas in red indicate those regions where a polar class 4 or 5 vessel, like the MV Palmer, just simply can't get through. Image on the right, that was also taken of July 1st of this year, but shows polar class 3 accessible areas, which the ARV is being designed to. Again, the areas in green are no problem. Areas in orange require a fair degree of ice breaking, but are accessible. And I would just note that this includes Pine Island and Thwaites Glacier regions, the Larsen Ice Shelf, and basically the entire Eastern Antarctic. And there are no red regions. So this is a massive increase in access throughout the entire Antarctic region for the scientific community. I won't go through this whole list, but there are a substantial number of characteristics and capabilities that the ARV is going to have. In addition to the larger size, ARV is going to provide over 8,000 square feet of reconfigurable lab spaces, more than 7,000 square feet of main deck working space, state-of-the-art CTD launch and recovery system with active heave comp, dedicated box keel and retractable drop keel for a large suite of acoustic systems, dedicated UAV or drone deck and hangar, and dedicated advanced scientific support boats. And we're even have a dedicated marine mammal observation space and a meteorological lab. At the future.usap.gov site, you'll find a ton of info on the current status of the design, studies leading up to the design, the who's who at NSF and our Leidos ARV contracting team, and the science community members who are actively engaged in helping to guide this effort. There's also FAQs and a whole lot more. So this is where you're going to find all of the latest drawings of the ship, and this should be updated prior to the February workshop. So all of you work on this effort. I definitely urge everyone to check it out and keep checking back for updates. And I can also let the group know when we've posted updates if that would help. So unfortunately, I'm not able to publicly share specific cost details, but I can at least speak at a high level about the key cost drivers. So there are two elements we look at when designing a ship. First are the construction costs. So what are those? What are the elements that drive cost of the ship? Certainly the size of the vessel plays a large role, but so do the number of personnel to be deployed and the endurance. That drives how much fuel we need to be able to store, which also drives how large the ship needs to be. Designing a ship to be a polar class 3 means it needs to be double hulled, so roughly twice as much steel as a non-polar class vessel, along with a whole host of other design elements to meet these stringent safety requirements. And unlike virtually all other foreign research icebreakers being built, we need to build the ARV in the US. It's just simply more expensive to do it here. The other element we need to look at when designing a ship are the estimated annual operational costs. So those include crew costs, as well as technical staff. And unlike lease vessels, the NSF will need to cover the cost of all the major overhauls and dry docking, which are required to be completed at set intervals by the Coast Guard and American Bureau of Shipping. And obviously, fuel consumption of a vessel this size will play an enormous role in the operational costs. And I just want to throw out some final thoughts. So USAP vessels account for roughly 20% of the annual USAP budget, and they're rising. The PRV and leasing vessel approaches were ultimately abandoned due to inability to afford to operate the vessels. The current ARV design remains within our operational budget expectations. However, adding other significant design elements would drive the ship to be substantially larger than ARV, very likely pushing the vessel back into the range where we just can't afford to operate it. Finally, the current ARV schedule delivers the ship around the time the MVP turns 40, which really is 10 years beyond the service life of most vessels. So there is a strong risk that significant delays to the project could result in the USAP not having any ship at all to support science. Now I'm going to pass it over to Roberta to talk about how the ARV fits within the total MRFC budget.
Thank you, Tim. So last week we discussed the future polar portfolio with the National Science Board, and also heard a presentation from the Chief of Research Facilities, who's Linnea Avalon, about the MREFC portfolio going forward. And she presented this graph that has, these are approximate costs, and they're approximate annual costs. And these annual costs are the monies that are set aside for the MREFC portfolio each year to address the projects for that particular year. And so, for example, in 2019, you see that there are 4 projects under consideration that were funded, and they include 2 telescope observatories, the regional class research vessels, and then an Antarctic recapitalization project dedicated to replacing buildings at McMurdo. And in 2021, you see that the portfolio changes, but in the time from about 2017 to 2024, you see that the rough investment is somewhere between 180 million a year and 300 million a year. If you start to add the Antarctic Research Vessel, and then there's one other project that we did not show because it's not ours to show, you see that the annual investment has to go up quite a bit in order to accommodate the construction of the ARV. And the line that you see with the dots on it represents the total average cost up to 2027 of all of those projects, plus one that you can't see, and the ARV. This is a very large step increase for the NSF budget request. And you can see immediately in 2028, it takes a very large jump again. And so the board is aware, and the director is aware, that this is an extremely expensive project. And hence, we are strongly discouraged from adding additional costs to it. And we are also strongly advised that we need to make the strongest science case possible to get a project of this magnitude through the MREFC process. So that is the shot across the bow that guides a lot of our thinking, and that puts us in this position of wanting to build the best vessel that we can, but watching costs like a hawk. I want to stop and ask if anyone has any questions about this graph, because it's an extremely important, and these are approximate numbers. I'm sure the cost of the vessel will change over time. One would hope that it would go down, but I'm not optimistic. But I want to see if anybody has any questions about this. Many of you are familiar with this MREFC portfolio, but some of you might not be. Paula.
Yeah, thank you, Tim and Roberta, for this. This is really helpful. On your out years, looking in sort of the 27, 28, 29 timeframe for your portfolio, do you expect, I mean, this is how to ask this. You're not expecting any more new start requests that you would have to lump onto this as far as the existing projects listed in that time space? Meaning your whole delta you wouldn't have a delta if you started out with something else new, you had an emergency that would be on top of this, right?
So this is a separate pot of funds that don't fall in our annual budget. These are really sort of controlled by the director's office until we reach that point where the vessel becomes operational and it gets turned over to a program to operate. So the other irons in the fire that we have are this turquoise line, which is first called AIMS, which is Antarctic Infrastructure Modernization, and then it transitions into Antarctic Infrastructure Recapitalization. This was a capital reinvestment program that stemmed from the Blue Ribbon Report, one of which, and is one of the reasons why I think we had to pause in developing the new vessel. But this was to modernize what was basically a very large deferred maintenance portfolio of infrastructure in Antarctica. And so that is ours, but it's not new. And once it's appropriated, unless there's something really significant, it would stay approximately at that level. Another project that I'm familiar with, RCRV, has had some bumps in its budget, primarily because of COVID and hurricanes. And the National Science Board has dealt with those by reorganizing the funding stream somewhat, but it's not a lot relative to the total initial allocation. So there might be other projects that come into the pipeline, but we don't expect that it will be ours. It's also important to note that the geosciences, of which polar is part, and mathematical and physical sciences are the biggest users of the MREFC portfolio, engineering less so. And so it's not surprising that this portfolio is dominated by telescopes and ships and things like that.
Thank you.
I guess if we could keep going to the next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to put the statement of task up because I think Tim's presentation and some of the earlier presentations, which I missed, but I could tell from the conversation what they covered, I think hit some of these points very well. And one is identify the highest priority science drivers for the Southern Ocean and Antarctic nearshore and coastal research, based on prior studies and reports. And also the workshop, I think, will contribute to this considerably. But really the question is, what are the science drivers? Why do we need this vessel? Because if we're asking taxpayers through our MREFC process and through the governance of the National Science Board to support this, the science has to be really, really compelling. And so that's probably the most fun part of the study. Why do we need to have this vessel? Next slide. And then what are the capabilities that are essential to support these science drivers? Recognizing that a vessel is a significant part of that portfolio, but over the last several decades, many other tools and technologies have been developed that have revolutionized how we do oceanography, and they continue to do so. So what other tools can we put in the tool chest, and how will they also help guide how we do the science of the future in Antarctica? And when we say in Antarctica, we really mean the Southern Ocean and that sort of ocean continent ice shelf interface, because it's incredibly important in that region. So we want to look at other technologies. We also want to look at other relationships and other partnerships. For example, we have ongoing interactions with the Coast Guard. They come and break ice for us every year. The Coast Guard is in the midst of developing the new polar security cutters the polar security covers will have helicopter capability. How can we partner with those if we don't have the helicopter capability that we would like to have? How are we partnering or potentially partnering with other nations and their research fleets? And so there are lots of different ways to approach science. One of the questions that we ask you to consider is, this will be an all-purpose vessel. If we have very specialized capabilities, or if we need very special capabilities, what is the cost of having them and carrying them on our own vessel relative to purchasing them or collaborating now and then? Is this something that we always have to have and always have to carry, or can we purchase it when we need it? So those are some of the issues that I think will guide some of the discussions. And the last slide, I think. And then what are the gaps between the science drivers and the portfolio of capabilities, and how can we address those? And I want to advise that, if you feel that there are critical things that we need to have, whether it's on the vessel or in other technologies, we want you to feel free to articulate them, but also recognize that if addition of certain capabilities puts us over a cost threshold, then we may be back in 2012, where we were told your operational costs are too high, go back to the drawing board. So we're between a potentially hard spot and a rock, and we need to be very careful how we approach adding capability so that we don't price ourselves out of the MREFC portfolio and our operational capabilities beyond that. Tim, did I miss anything?
No, I think you nailed it. Thank you.
Okay.
Great. Thank you all very much. That was incredibly helpful. And we have some time for questions from the committee, and committee members use the raise hand function, please. Alan. I think you're muted, Alan. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Kim just sent a few questions to ask because she had to leave to another meeting. So I'll just read her questions. First, I actually haven't even read them yet. I just got them. What is the plan if there are delays in the ARV delivery? In other words, will there be a midlife refit of the NBP to extend its life beyond 40 years, or would there be another plan?
So the MVP is already 30 years old, so we wouldn't do a midlife. Around 5 years ago or so, we did have a naval architect firm do an assessment on the condition of the polymer to see if it was suitable and in good enough condition to operate until it was roughly 40 years old. And it is. It's in remarkably good shape. Edison Schwest does an excellent job of keeping the ship in good condition. We are seeing the inevitable declines, though, with a ship of this age. Systems go down a lot, but more frequently. When the ship goes into the yard for a couple of weeks, ends up staying a little bit longer because they uncover more corroded rust and damaged metal and whatnot. Our plan is therefore to continue to keep operating the MB polymer until the ARV is delivered. But obviously, there's going to be a limit, which is why I raised that point earlier. The ship can't run too much beyond 40 years of age, and as it continues to run that long, we increase the risk of it failing mid-cruise.
Okay, Kim has a second question. In light of, I guess Roberta commented on if we don't build some capabilities into the ship, special purpose or too costly or whatever, we may need to effectively buy them or partner with them. And so Kim's question is, what is NSF looking for from us in terms of recommendations for potential partners? Should we recommend MOUs or just provide a list of international vessels, stations, and other resources? Or however you want to riff on that. And Roberta, I think.
Okay, I'll start, but I think Tim can probably shed more light. And in general, it would be helpful for us and Margot and Deb and others in the Academy and Amanda, sorry, take note that understanding our partnerships in the Antarctic world would be very helpful. So the Antarctic National Program operators routinely collaborate with one another to carry out science, to do medevacs, to bail one another out of certain situations, because it's a tough place to work, and collaboration is really critical. And so it might be helpful for us to put a list of the kinds of collaborations we've had that have been driven by NSF, of which there are many examples, but also there have been PI-driven collaborations as well, as Alan knows. So I would say that we can inform this conversation so that you understand where our relationships are and where the capabilities are. I can tell you firsthand that I've talked to the head of BASS, the British Antarctic Survey. They went from 2 vessels to 1, and they're very eager to collaborate on projects and certain logistics, because they would like to be as efficient as possible, as do we. So it's a good environment for having those conversations.
Hey, thanks.
All right, thank you, Alan. Dan.
Hi, that was a presentation, was very informative. I knew there were road bumps in getting the new vessel. I had no idea the ins and outs that you guys have had to go with to get us where we are today. That really puts things in perspective in a way I didn't have before. My question is there's no question that the new research vessel, the ARV, is the centerpiece of the committee's charge. I'm curious how far away, I mean, obviously it's going to be science driven, but what about, should we be looking at questions that may, well, for example, use small boat operations? Or, I mean, the other big question is, we currently have 2 ships, the Gould. I know you've mentioned the coastal research vessels. Is that within anything we should be addressing in terms of other forms of platforms for ship operations, small boats and the like? Or is, can you help us either constrain or tell us the scope of how far away from the ARV should we be looking?
Tim, over to you.
Yeah, I can speak to some of that. So if you look at the future.usf.gov site, we do talk a lot about small boat capabilities for the new ship. I think adding elements like that is within the scope of this committee. Talking about how we can achieve the science that needs to happen off the ship. But I think you're going to have to come short of saying, well, we need a second ship. That's outside the scope, in my view. But I defer to Roberta on that one. But yeah, I think, in my view, again, I think if you have ideas on how we can execute certain mission types, whether it's through partnerships or through augmenting, with, say, small boats or other capabilities, certainly bring those up and into the report. We may, it's something for us to be able to consider, but we'll have to assess how much we can actually afford to implement it. I don't know, Roberta, if you've got anything. Okay.
And is there an expiration date on the Gould?
So we are in the process of reviewing the Gould's efforts with us. We are, within the last 5 years or so, commercial opportunities in the peninsula have expanded. So we're exploring other ways to resupply Palmer Station outside of having the Gould. And we are also talking with our OCE friends and make it their
Someone's.
yeah. Anyway, we're talking with our OCE friends. We're talking with our other National Antarctic Program friends about ways that we can share science capabilities.
I think somebody has an open mic. If we could all just make sure we're muted.
Oh, no, Dan just turned his mic off. Okay.
Sorry about that.
I just want to add, without being partisan toward any particular institution, but in our discussions with ocean sciences, we have recognized that there are some parts of the Southern Ocean, as many of you know, that have been accessible by UNOLS vessels for quite some time. And also Antarctic vessels have done work for UNOLS. And so we're looking to strengthen that partnership to bring more capability down to the Southern Ocean. And certainly the new RCRVs that have some degree of ice strengthening offer some capabilities, and we'll just continue to explore that.
Thank you, Roberta. Let's move on to Andy Thompson.
Yeah, thanks very much for your time today. In our briefing book, we saw that there is a ARV Science Advisory Subcommittee that has some very talented people on it that are advising you. And I was wondering if you could say a few words about how this group should interface with that group and how our goals might be similar or slightly different.
Sure. Well, all of those members are identified on our future.usf.gov site. I wish there was a shorter way of referring to that website than all that, but they're all listed there. All their email addresses are there. You are all completely free to engage with them on any level that you would like. They are certainly aware that this committee has been stood up and that the workshop is being planned in February. I suspect many of them will participate. So I fully encourage full engagement with those talented group of people. Did that answer your question, or was there something else? You're muted.
I think you're muted, Andy.
Yeah. Could you say a few words about how our goals would be different from what they're trying to do?
So the Science Advisory Subcommittee looks specifically at the design capabilities of the ARV as it's been progressing through this current phase. Within this current phase, there will have been 4 interim design reviews. The Science Advisory Subcommittee sits in on those. They provide some feedback to NSF through the advisory committee on ways to improve the design. They'll look at the flow of science from the main deck into the labs. They'll look at the habitability of the science berthing, location of cranes and overboarding equipment, and provide suggestions on how the design should be improved. So they're looking specifically at how the design of the ship is being developed. I think this subcommittee, you can look at how the design of the ship is and then identify what gaps may exist.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
All right, next to Heather Lynch. I think you're muted, Heather. Okay, let's move on to Alan Mix. We'll come back to Heather.
Okay. Roberta brought up the issue of calling on other assets, including some of the UNOLS vessels to do work in high southern latitudes. And so actually question is what is the relationship to UNOLS here? And is this vessel a separate entity from UNOLS? Is it able to share equipment through the UNOLS pool? Is it to be operated on contract as the current operations are? or will it effectively be part of the UNOLS fleet?
Excellent question. So we already are heavily integrated within UNOLS. We contribute to the Multi-Beam Advisory Committee financially, the winch pool, the tech groups. So there's a lot of integration between OPP and the USAP and UNOLS. The current ARV vessel, though, we have not yet determined whether it's going to be a UNOLS vessel or not, or what type of entity will actually operate the ship. That is something that should be coming around in the next couple of years. So it's TBD at the moment. Either way, whoever ends up operating the ship on behalf of NSF, there's going to be close ties with UNOLS.
Implying when we talk about technologies that are going to be on the ship, we should also be having some UNOLS input about technologies.
Absolutely.
And then another question, somewhat related. You started, Tim, with the presentation about the ill-fated PRV process. Will this ship ever jump hemispheres?
It certainly would be able to. The one thing is, it's roughly a 30-day deadhead from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere, at least to the poles. So that's that's a big time commitment. So 30 days each way. But the ship is being designed to be able to work in the tropics. That's something we learned with the NBP. Trying to take it to Tahiti, the air conditioners weren't used to it. So this ship will have the capability of transiting the equator if necessary.
Okay, and some of this gets into a question about the area of operations and scope of what we talk about on ship capabilities. There's been a lot of riffing on the words coastal and nearshore, but our title is Southern Ocean and Coastal and Nearshore, et cetera. And so we've interpreted that as addressing the full geographic range of its expected operations. Is that a correct interpretation from your perspective?
That's correct in my view. I think the emphasis on coastal in this regard is due to the ARV's enhanced icebreaking capabilities. We're going to be able to get a lot closer to the coast in all periods.
Pretty obvious that's a key element, but at the same time, as we talk about what the Gould does, whether we're drawing on other UNOLS assets, and there's a big Southern Ocean out there outside the ice, and so we are interpreting that as full geographic area of operations.
Yep.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, Alan. Back to Heather.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, good. So actually that my question connects to what was just being discussed, which is very close to nearshore work. And in my experience, the Gould is too big and a bit too cumbersome to do a lot of work in coastal areas where you have personnel getting on and off the boat to get onto shore when you don't have a pier. It's not great at that kind of work. And in the past, when I've tried to budget yacht-based work, I was not allowed to because of some of the liability issues of working in a really small vessel like that. And I'm just kind of curious whether those partnerships would be allowed moving forward, or what kinds of really small boats might be part of this portfolio, because now the new research vessel is going to be even larger than the Gould, and it's not going to be able to get into some of these really shallow areas that are not well charted, and I think that we'll still be reliant on yachts and very small boats. So maybe you could just speak to that.
I can speak to the first part of your question. So yes, the ARV is definitely larger than the Gould. It's also going to have a far more capable sonar suite. So it will be able to, the ARV will actually be shallow enough draft that it can tie up at Palmer Station if necessary. But the ARV is also going to have an acoustic suite that will allow it to, including a forward-looking sonar system that allow it to navigate into the shallower, narrower, uncharted areas that we experience. Right now, the Gould doesn't have anything like that. And so they take a very risk-averse approach and stay way offshore, forcing the small boats to transit on their own. Simultaneously with the ARV, we are looking at providing enhanced beach landing watercraft. So like some of the rigid hull inflatable boats with aluminum hulls that can land on rocky beaches, landing craft as well. And these we are focusing on improving their ability to navigate, say, brash ice or some of the more choked up ice situations that we encounter. As far as getting proposals approved or whatever on smaller craft like yachts, I will pass that to either Maria or Roberta to address.
I am not prepared to address that question at this point in time. I will note, though, that the NBP, I'm sorry, not the NBP, but the ARV will have some small boats that it can launch, correct? And that coupled with the characteristics of those smaller boats and the NBP's or the ARV's own capabilities, that will fill a niche that hasn't been filled. Is that a fair statement?
Definitely, yep.
Do you know, sorry, what the range of those small boats would be away from the research vessel?
Of the type of vessel that we're looking at, I could see anywhere from 15 to 20 miles from the ship.
Thank you.
Obviously, depending on conditions, visibility, all of that.
Okay, next we have Margot.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I have a slightly more logistical question regarding what you hope to get out of the community workshop versus the consensus report. Obviously, the workshop is an opportunity for you to hear from a wide swath of the science community. But would you like it, are you hoping that it would have a slightly different focus than our report as a whole? Or is it really just the same statement of tasks we should apply to the community workshop, and that's what our speakers should speak to, and that's the discussions we should have?
I'll start by saying I think it's so critical for us to have a strong statement about the science drivers for work in the Southern Ocean and at the continental margins. I think that our supporters really need to hear the why behind the what we're asking for, and that if we don't have that up front and center, that we will lose an opportunity. So to me, having fresh minds come together and really think about the forward questions that are critical for science and critical for the nation, recognizing, number one, that we have an obligation to be present in Antarctica and to conduct groundbreaking science in Antarctica. And if at some point, I would be happy to give you a small lecture on why we are the lead agency and what our responsibilities are to the Antarctic continent, as something that's been framed within our national policy for 60 years. And so this isn't just something that NSF does. This is something that the nation has invested in and stands behind. However, there are always choices as to how the nation invests in its scientific enterprise. And what we want to provide is the strongest argument for the nation to invest in Antarctic science because it's so critical. What we'd also like to have is the most forward-thinking advanced approaches that we might use to address those questions, because we know from many studies, and some of which have been spoken about today, that having seagoing capability on a vessel is critical, but there are many other ways to address questions now that weren't available to us even 20 years ago. And so how do these new capabilities allow us to go forward and answer these questions? really, what happens in the Southern Ocean doesn't stay in the Southern Ocean. As we all know, it affects the rest of the world. And so presenting those arguments in a very concise form and why we need to be there is one of the most important things you can do. And then helping us understand the best way to approach it is also very critical.
Thanks, Margot. So on that note, I don't see anybody else's hand up. I'm just going to ask maybe a final question. We've talked a lot about the ship, and earlier we had the presentations on the previous reports. I have a question on the science. I understand the 2011 report was the blue sky sort of, what are the priorities? And we're in 2022, right? So I wonder if there's been like an assessment of how that report has landed, successes, other things, you found over the course of the execution of that, what insight you might have into that being a living document. Should we start there is one of the things we've been talking about, and see what's been a success, and then maybe what has shifted in priorities, that kind of thing. So how best to use that report in your thoughts? That wasn't directed at anybody in particular. Well, I was going to wait for Roberta.
Yeah, the 2011 report does talk about a revitalization of the polar fleet. And you might have noticed that our nation's not very good at building icebreakers or maintaining the ones that we have. It's been like pulling teeth, and that's always a good place to start. But at the same time, it applies to, and this is just a personal opinion here, and I'm open to rebuttal, that I don't want to offer an excuse for dragging feet on this vessel just because we've dragged our feet on the polar security cutters too. I think the science arguments are so compelling, and there's an urgency to understanding the ice sheets in particular, as well as carbon sinks and carbon cycling and questions about whether the Southern Ocean really is chewing up carbon dioxide or spitting it out through upwelling versus downwelling. These are things that we need to know a lot sooner. They're not something that we can postpone for 5 or 10 years. We need to keep at it, and we need a vessel that's going to, we need to keep that capability as well.
Thank you. Other questions from the committee? Last call. Yes, Jill.
Yeah, I'll probably just be reiterating a point that's already been made, but it seems to me one of the tensions here is this definition of coastal versus nearshore that we were discussing earlier, and this new capability that the ship is going to have being a polar class 3. So am I correct in thinking part of our charge is also thinking in that space about the science drivers? And that can go to anyone.
Let me respond. As a scientist, one of the really strengths that the MVP has is that it's a great ship for both open ocean and breaking ice. And we really realize that we need to keep those two aspects. So I would say that you can concentrate on the science drivers, both for open ocean and for coastal. Having higher ice-breaking capabilities does not mean that the ARV would not be also a great ship for open ocean. So I would not see it so much as an either or. We are really working to get this ship to be a great replacement for the MVP.
Does it in some way also open up new space though as well? Is I guess what I was getting at. So not just an either or, but it also see that one graph was really compelling about sea ice thickness and access.
So what is your question? Sorry.
No, that's fine. It was just a comment more about the enhanced access capability of this ship.
Well, for example, if we don't come up with science drivers that say we really want this full access through those areas that used to be red, would you not build it? I think there are plenty of science drivers and it's great, but is that where you were going, Jill? Is how do we capitalize on this capability of a polar class 3?
Well, there's been all those reports that Tim showed, that I participated in some of them. All of them call for higher ice-breaking capabilities. So I do not expect, that the community, after 20 years of asking for more ice-breaking capabilities, it will take a step back.
So I know we're at the end of our time, but Dan has his hand up. Do you want to take one more question, Margot? Is that okay? Or do you want to?
Say it's up to NSF. If you all can hang on for one more question, we will.
Okay, Dan.
I may not want to hear this question. I want to come back to Heather, and you may not be able to answer this, but it may give us guidance as to whether we should even enter into this in the committee. And I think it's exciting to hear what you're talking about in terms of small boat operations from the new vessel. One of the issues, though, is that means that those small boats are still going to be tied to the vessel. And where I'm going to is this question of partnerships. As some of you know, I've worked on a lot of different platforms, some non-traditional platforms within the Antarctic. Is it at all within our should we be looking into alternative, like getting us, especially in the peninsula, where there are other ways of getting maybe one science team on a smaller vessel that's completely independent? Is that even anything we should be discussing? Because they tend to be relatively inexpensive compared to a big ship, but it also, in terms of resources, you're not tying an entire polar research vessel to a study that could be done off of a smaller vessel that's much more nimble. Is that even worth us discussing?
I'm going to go down a couple of different paths to try and answer this question. Probably none of which will be satisfying, but I'll give it a shot. I'm going to go back to Alan's emphasis about, where are the big science questions? As I think, a first place to go. I do feel that some of these nearshore capabilities are the kinds of things that we put together, as you've described, Dan, the way we put together field camps in strange places. We think about it, we come up with different capabilities, and we put together a package. And I guess one question is, how often does that not work? How often have we been in a situation where it was we didn't find a way to do it, as opposed to, the large number of questions that we absolutely couldn't approach if we didn't have a research vessel. And I think the other step back that I want to take is, I know that there's been many comments about the recent vessels that have come into Antarctic portfolios, the Norwegian vessel, the Australian vessel, and their tremendous capabilities, and they're wonderful, and they're happy to work with us. I also, at the same time, want to emphasize that as Tim said, 20% of our operations are marine dedicated. Our capabilities on the continent are really considerable, and they are far greater than any other national programs. And so as we're thinking about, well, why is the U.S. not doing this or that? The U.S. does many other things and enhances our capabilities in many other ways. And so we've asked you to think about a marine portfolio, but do keep in mind that marine portfolio sits in a backdrop of much bigger capabilities. And some of which could be dedicated to some of the other questions that you're thinking about today.
Thank you, that helped.
Okay, well, with that, it looks like we've come to the end of our time. So I'd like to thank all the speakers, both the representatives from the various former reports and this incredible helpful input from NSF. All appreciated. Also, thanks to the committee and thanks to everyone out there who's attending that we can't see on our screens. I know there are quite a few people out there. Just remind everybody that information about future meetings and in particular the upcoming community workshop that'll be in February will be posted on the study website. So stay tuned into that website. And with that, Margot, unless you have other comments, I'm seeing you shaking your head. I'll just say thank you to all. Have a great day, and we'll look forward to much more input from the community and discussion about all these things. Thanks very much.